So in this last video of Unit 8, we're going to talk about summarizing categorical data in relative or two-way relative frequency tables. So before we can do two-way relative frequency tables, we have to know, well, what is relative frequency? Relative frequency is simply the ratio of the number of observations in a category to the total number. To the total number of observations. So to create a two-way two-way relative frequency table, we simply divide this ratio of the values by the total number of observations and simply replace them with their corresponding percent. So looking at the first example, we've got a manager at a gym conducted a survey to determine whether the gym members prefer rock climbing, weightlifting, or neither. They also asked members whether they regularly bring guests to the gym. So those are the two things we're comparing. We essentially want to change the frequency table so the frequency numbers to percents. So we have our total always in the bottom left right-hand corner, which is always 100% of those who are surveyed, right? So we're going to just take every number in here, like such as 48, and I'm going to divide it by 200 and then multiply it by 100 to get my percent. So that actually changes to 24%. That's 24%. Then I'll do the same thing with the 64. Do 64 over 200 times by 100. That's going to give me 32%. And then finally with the 88, I could do 88 divided by 200 and multiply by 100 to get my percent of 44. Now I know I've done this right, and I always double check my work because 44 plus 32 plus 24 will add up to 100. And if it doesn't, that means I did my math wrong. And I'm going to do that with the rest of these numbers here. So starting with the 74 divided by 20 times 100 is 37%. And then 126 divided by 200 times 100 is 63%. So maybe at this time, why don't you pause the video and try and calculate the rest of this table. And I'll just kind of fill in as you go. So starting with the bringing guests column, weightlifting, that's 43%. And then below that is 12. And below that is 8. So again, these will all add up to 63 if done correctly. And then for my don't bring guests column, I'll have 1% that are weightlifters, then 20% that are rock climbers, and 16% that do neither one. Again, I know I've done this correctly because this will add up to 37 and these totals will add up to 100. So why don't you try the next one and oh wait, before I do, hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we do the next one on our own, I wanted to answer the question off to the right. What is the joint frequency of rock climbing and bringing guests? So to calculate that, I'm going to look at my rock climbing row and my bringing guests and see where they kind of overlap, and that would be at 12. So about 12% will rock climb and bring guests. So now that we've answered that question, why don't you go ahead and try the next one on your own. So before you could go ahead and do any percents, you have to know your total. So hopefully you took a second and you filled in the rest of this table. So my total that own a dog is 15, that do not is 25. The total that own a cat would be 17, that do not own a cat would be, let's see, 23. And altogether we have 40 people that were surveyed. So I'm always going to start with 100% in the bottom right-hand corner. Starting with those that do not own a cat, that was a total of 57.5%, leaving me with 42.5% that own a cat. Then for the column that do not own a dog, 27.5% own a cat, making 35% that do not own a cat or a dog, and that gives me 62.5% down here. And then in my column that has own a dog, 15% also own a cat, but 22.5% do not own a cat but have a dog, leaving me with a total of 37.5 down here. And then answering the question to the right, what is the joint frequency data for someone owning not a cat or a dog? That would be right here at 35%. So then the last thing we're going to look at is conditional relative frequency, which is also a ratio. Man, sometimes I get too close to the top. So is the ratio of the joint, there's a typo, joint frequency to the marginal frequency. Okay, and so this is best described through an example. So it says the dance squad is planning to buy new uniforms. The coach asked members of the varsity and JV squads which color they would prefer, and the results are seen below. So in question A, it says, well, what percent of members who prefer blue uniforms are on the varsity squad? Okay, so let's look at the varsity squad total, which is 39%. And we're going to, I'm sorry, I reread that. Let me read this. So it says what percent of those who prefer blue. So I'm going to look at this row. That's a total of 30, right? 30%. So of that 30%, how many are on the varsity squad? So that'd be 19. And so I'm going to divide that ratio of 19 to 30 and multiply it by 100 and get 63.3%. So then the next question states, okay, so what percent of the JV squad, so I'm going to be looking down to this total, so of that would be, highlighted it too much, I couldn't see that. So that would be out of 61%, how many of them preferred red? And that would be 28. So I would divide that, multiply it by 100, and I get a percentage of 45.9%. In question C, it says, well, what percent of members who prefer black uniforms? So again, I'm going to be looking at this row's total, which is 38. So 38. How many of them are on the JV squad? And that would be, let's see, 22. So I divide that, multiply it by 100, and I will get 57.9. And finally, Part D says, well, what percentage of the varsity squad, so there's a total of 39% of them on varsity, prefer blue? That would be 19. Divide it, multiply it by 100, and you get 48.7%. So now that you've seen this example, why don't you guys go ahead and try the next one on your own. So it says the library staff is conducting a survey of local students in efforts to attract more patrons to the library. They ask students which programs they would be interested, either it's going to be book club or after school tutoring. So question A says, what percentage of students who are interested in book club, so I'm going to be looking at this total, which is 53. So of that 53%, how many of them live between 1 and 3 miles? That is 30. So when I divide that and multiply it by 100, hopefully you got 60%. And then the last question says, well, what percentage of students who are interested in tutoring? So that total is 47%. How many of them live less than a mile away? That looks to be 36. And I'll, divide that, multiply it by 100, and you get approximately 76.6%.